Hello, and welcome to How Books Are Made, a podcast about the art and science of making books. I'm Arthur Atwell. People who make books, like me and perhaps you too, we get a deep sense of satisfaction from being creative. Many years ago, stuck in the aftermath of a failed startup, I discovered that the most restorative thing you can do for yourself is to make things, even simple little things, to just be creative. The very act of creating things renews your faith in yourself. And the only thing better than being creative is to be creative with other people. And creative collaboration is the heart of any healthy community. Creative communities are such a force for good in the world. Their creative energy sustains them, even in the face of intractable collective action problems. They can be as enormous as Wikipedia and as small as your local writers group. Of course, online creative communities are built around specific systems, and someone has to build those, often not knowing if they'll work at all. Two of my favorite systems in bookmaking are LibriVox and Pressbooks. Both are creations of Hugh McGuire, whose work and thinking I've admired for years. Thousands and thousands of people have created books and audiobooks on Hugh's systems, and I long wanted to ask him about how they came to be and what we can learn from his experience. Hugh, it's so lovely to see you today. Thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Wonderful to be here, Arthur.
So I noticed in your LinkedIn bio you say, I think quite modestly, I build new communities who use new tools. And of course, it glosses over the fact that you actually build the tools as well as the communities. So that's something I really want to talk in more detail with you about. Before we do, though, I was fascinated to find out, looking through your history, that 25 years ago, you were not working in books or even in audio, but you were working in the energy industry on climate and environment projects. Was that your plan? Career in the energy industry?
I think that going back to schooling, so I did degrees in philosophy and engineering. So I have always felt like I've had one foot in technical and one foot in literary books and reading. And I guess the entry into climate, that probably would have been maybe the third plank. The environment was something that seemed like that would be a good place to spend time. And so I ended up getting a job at a nonprofit that was funded by a bunch of electric utility companies, and their mandate was roughly sustainable development. And that led into working in climate finance, where it was the early days of carbon trading. And so the idea is, can we raise money from polluting companies and fund efficient, good projects that are reducing emissions elsewhere? I don't think energy in particular was of interest, but it was, I think, the environmental aspect and kind of, again, this balancing of, let's say, trying to do good in the world with trying to make a living. So that's kind of how I ended up there. And actually, I ended up doing the sorts of things I do in part because it seemed like the climate universe was so rife with legislation and political things that had to happen. And it sort of felt like there was a lot of banging heads against the wall that was going to continue happening in that space, which ended up being true. I mean, I left that world in 2002. I mean, I continued to do things around it for a couple of years after that, but I got seduced by the world of the open web and open collaboration and open source, with kind of this idea that there was a different model that we could just build and people would come along. I think that also was overly idealistic. There is sort of a pathway there from the climate work into the world of open publishing that I ended up spending most of my time in.
Sure. I mean, even though climate work and engineering seems very different, the kinds of work you were doing, from what I can tell, were even then creating tools and trying to solve collective action problems, I suppose, where you need a lot of people to work on something that no one person is going to benefit directly from. I believe that 20 years ago, you were packing for a long trip and looking for audiobooks, and the idea for LibriVox came to you.
Sort of after I had left the work I was doing in climate stuff, I took some time off to do some writing. And then I got kind of caught up in this notion of this kind of mass collaboration universe that Wikipedia was probably. So there was the open source software world that I found very intriguing, but I'm not a software developer. But I just found the philosophy around it so interesting and exciting. And then to see real world examples of the kinds of things that could happen around this with Wikipedia, that was kind of the underpinning. And then I thought, gee, there must be a project out there that's getting people to make audiobooks with that kind of model. And it turned out there wasn't really. And so I thought, well, I would like to have a free audiobook for this long trip. Why don't I start this project? So I can't remember if it was just before I left or just after I left. There were a bunch of people who were doing these kind of public domain audiobooks at the time, sort of these individuals. And I think in particular, what happened was that someone had recorded the first 5 or 6 chapters of Lady Chatterley's Lover, and she hadn't finished it. And I thought, gee, that's really annoying because I would like to hear all of it. And so this kind of concept, well, what if we had a sort of collective project, an open volunteer project to get people to do these things? It would accelerate a lot faster. So that's how LibriVox came about.
And am I right that it now has over 19,000 books in its catalog? Over 13,000 different people have read books or read chapters for books in 47 different languages, and other projects building on its API, reusing that content. I mean, that sounds extraordinary.
That sounds about right. I'm very rarely engaged in the day-to-day. It's something that I feel a little bit of guilt about and have for many, many years. But I mentioned it to someone and they're like, well, that's great. You set up a framework, process, a vision, and a community that has just kind of continued on with that. That's excellent. Well done. And that's kind of how I feel about it. So yeah, so I think those numbers, as far as I know, they're correct. My last project with LibriVox was building a system that helped manage the sort of workflow for the volunteers who participate. So that data, in theory, is probably pretty good. So yeah, so I think, yeah, closing in on 20,000. And it's been about 1,000 books a year, basically not quite the first year, but close to the first year. It's been about 1,000 books a year published. And so 20 sounds about right. And yeah, we'll have our 20th anniversary next August. So
really amazing thing. You said in an interview once of the recordings themselves, and I'm going to read a little quote here. Our recordings have mistakes, fumbles, coughs, and beautiful human voices being human, reading wonderful works of literature. It's not just transmission of audio information. It's something much more and something no computer, robot, etc. could ever replicate. Personally, I'm very much interested in what the readers get out of the process as much as the listeners. What do you see the readers getting out of creating those audiobooks?
Well, I don't think there'd be one answer, but I guess my driving force of the things that I've done in my professional life since leaving Climate is just the fundamental belief I have is that creating something and sharing it is the most powerful and meaningful thing we can do in our lives, or maybe not the most, but among the most. And so I think that it's just that expression of wanting to do something and make something that, and not just make something, but share it to the world. That's what it's about. And we always, in fact, to the detriment of sometimes of the quality of the recordings, et cetera, our focus was always, let's make it easier and better and just a process for the people who want to make these books. And that's sort of our target market. And so we never cared how many downloads we had or what was the most popular book or ratings or anything. We never did any of that. It was always just, what do we do to help foster this small community who cares about doing this? That has always been the focus. And it's interesting since then, in those early days, there were these awful machine read versions of audiobooks. Mm-hmm. And I guess it was a year and a half ago, I got contacted by some people at Microsoft who were trying to figure out what to do. They were building some voices that were going to read public domain books as part of their AI voice program. They ended up doing a huge collection of stuff and putting it on the Internet Archive. And it's fantastic. It's really great. AI, in some sense, is going to replace the functional kind of process of recording audiobooks in meaningful ways. And they did a great job. But to me, great, that's good. What I care about is, do people want to keep recording them and sharing them with the world? And if so, then LibriVox is a place to do that. So I think about a lot of these things that are most interesting are things that people do because they love doing it. Mm. And the internet is an amazing place to share that to the benefit of others if they wish, but that the most interesting thing is the doing it. And no one ever wonders why it is that people play recreational soccer on Thursday afternoons without pay and without an audience or whatever. It's they do it because they love it. And so just finding ways to help people do the things they love and share them with the world for whoever wants them, I find that just a powerful driver, I guess.
I think it's absolutely wonderful to actually consciously recognize that the creating of the audiobook and of the art or of the soccer game is kind of obviously as important or more important than ensuring that you have listeners or quote unquote an audience or a market. You did build a business alongside LibriVox called Iambic, which produces quote unquote professional audiobooks. Did that grow out of your experience with LibriVox?
It did. That project is almost fully wound down now. So I don't know if you know much about the audiobook business, but I don't know if it's any nicer than it was then. But at the time, digital audio was dominated by Audible,
Right.
the Amazon company, and their terms were not very favorable. And I had which is not untypical of me, interesting idea, not necessarily the keenest business insight. And I thought it would be great for independent literary novels to have audiobook versions of them. It turns out that there's not a huge lucrative market, especially when the percentage you get from Audible is shockingly low. So our idea was to match audiobook recorders with rights holders and kind of build things that way. In the end, Audible actually launched something called ACX, which modeled that. One of my claims to fame is I can say that Amazon stole one of my business ideas. But anyway, so the literary fiction side of things never made any money, and we stopped doing that. And then it continued for several years, probably 10 years after that, doing a small number of audio recordings of textbooks.
Interesting.
For some educational publishers. I think the AI voice generated outputs has kind of ended up killing that business finally. So that was my first effort to try to take, actually maybe my second effort, to take some of the things that I learned in LibriVox and apply it to the world of something that might be a business. And anyway, it lasted for 10 or 12 years or something like that. It never was a huge moneymaker, but it kept a number of independent audiobook narrators employed and a manager and things like that. So it had some positive impact on the world.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. And I think that you probably underestimate the kind of example setting you were doing to others, not just who want to create audiobooks, but who were just looking at what does it take to build new businesses, doing new things in publishing. And so many of these ideas that arrive and then become profitable in the hands of others later on, like like Audible, need to happen in the studies of bold entrepreneurs first. You'd also gone to start several projects in bookmaking, including bite-sized edits and Book Oven, before Pressbooks, which really established itself as a really, I think, significant step in making HTML first or digital first books possible. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. One thing I did want to ask, though, in all these cases, you're building, as we said, tools and you're building communities. And when you set out on a new venture, how much do you think you're thinking about building the community and how much are you just focusing on creating the tool and we'll figure out the community later? Because both things take work, right? Neither happens by accident.
I think I'm always trying to do both at once. Actually, in fact, Pressbooks is probably the one project I've done where that wasn't built in from the start. And I wouldn't suggest that the reason it was more successful was because of that. But I do think that there's, to your point, there's a focus problem. Focusing on building a big community is difficult. Focusing on building a working tool is difficult. And so trying to do both on relatively, not venture capital budgets is not so easy. I have some new projects that I'm working on right now. And it's really that community place, I think, that is most interesting to me. And it's hard to say, like, there are so many things where that just is built in by default. Would you say that Uber and Airbnb are communities? I don't think you would anymore. But I think there's just a huge amount of power in that we still haven't tapped properly in many domains. I would guess that if I were to think about it, the tools to me are always a means to an end of some kind. And so what's the end? I guess if I were to dream of what I want most in the world, it's communities of people doing wonderful creative things together somehow or other that wasn't possible before this kind of connective tissue of the web. So I think the community is really the driving force, but you just need the tools to make all that happen.
For those who don't know it, can you tell us what Pressbooks is?
Sure. Pressbooks, just a quick backup. LibriVox, which is a global community of makers of audiobooks, was enabled by a bunch of tools that existed that we cobbled together to make this community and make a publishing workflow. And there was Audacity was a open source free recording platform. And we used PHPBB, which was a free forum software, and WordPress, I guess, as a website. Just about everything kind of ran on those things. And we did a little bit more afterwards. But anyway, so I guess the insight was you could use these tools and then build a community to do something. And coming out of that experience, it seemed to me that there should be a tool online that you could use to make a book. And that was the original company Book Oven, and Bite Size Edits kind of came out of that, was this kind of idea. Let's build a tool set to allow a community to come together to make books. And that we couldn't quite get that off the ground at the scale that we needed it to. And then Pressbooks kind of evolved out of that as, okay, let's just focus on the tools and not worry about the community aspect, and make a tool that people can make books online. And the idea is a web-based interface. This is kind of old hat now, but a web-based interface that would have outputs that would include ebook output, PDF for print output, and there would be a web version for those who wanted it, which in the early days was not very many people. That was the concept behind Pressbooks, and has continued on doing just that.
And it's interesting you say it's old hat by now. I think it's old hat for you. Maybe for me, I've been building something similar for a good 8 years. But just recently, one of the sharp tech companies of the world, 37 Signals, they've just released a new web-based interface for creating books. And I think it's great that they're doing it. But those of us who've been doing it already for 10 or 15 years, we raise our eyebrows a little bit at the claim that it's new and revolutionary, because we've been plugging away at it for so long. So yes, old hat to us. But the rest of the world is just beginning to realize that creating books online, and especially collaboratively, and then being able to output a PDF and an EPUB, maybe a website version of the book as well, is exciting. And it's hugely gratifying to me that we were right, Hugh. We were right all this time later.
I think, well, it's kind of to your point earlier that I think the time has been here for a long time. And there's a number, there's a bunch of projects out there that do this. So yeah, the idea that they're new is quite surprising. But I think at the end, anyone who's building a software business of any kind, the fundamental thing for success is, what's the business model that makes it work? Pressbooks kind of backed into a business model by accident, because I was interested in the thing itself, and we kind of built the thing itself. And that's something it's probably the most obvious thing in the universe, but it's something that I have underestimated in my career many times, is getting that business model first and then building the things that support that, rather than build a cool thing and hopefully I can figure out what a business can look like.
For sure. If we can allow ourselves to get into the weeds a little bit about how Pressbooks works behind the scenes. How do you make a book with Pressbooks as a user? And then what's happening behind the scenes that means you can make a book without needing layout software like Adobe InDesign or MS Word?
So first of all, Pressbooks is built on top of WordPress. So when you use Pressbooks, it looks a lot like WordPress. And roughly speaking, each post, we consider that a chapter. We've kind of reorganized the whole internal administration of the system so that it's focused on bookmaking. But basically, you make a post, which turns into a chapter in the book. And we take, all the HTML that's kind of in WordPressy HTML, but we convert that into a very structured format. And then that gets exported into EPUB. And then it also gets converted using cascading style sheets. We convert that using actually Prints, which I think you use. Mm-hmm. So a conversion engine, which will convert that into type layout ready for a book. Basically, you make essentially a bunch of blog posts in Pressbooks, and then we output for you a book that is formatted with title page and table of contents and page numbering and footers and headers and chapters and all the kinds of things that you expect in a book.
It's absolutely fantastic to be able to create something that looks that good with no particular technical knowledge or design layout knowledge.
Yeah.
That's really, I think, perhaps been at the heart of its growth. Specifically, it's grown in the open education resources space.
Yeah. So in the end, I think the growth came from the place that I was always most interested in, but most people in the book world were not, which was the web-based book. And so in fact, what's happened over time is that PDF output has become, it's still important, but in the early days, our users were self-published authors mainly who wanted print-on-demand books published into CreateSpace or wherever. But in the end, with the open educational space, so I should probably explain that. So this is an educational movement driven mainly in the US and Canada, where textbooks are very expensive. And there's been a movement to develop free, openly licensed textbooks, digital textbooks that students can access for free. That really has ended up being our overwhelmingly primary business, is serving that community. And it's largely higher ed institutions, so universities and colleges, who are our clients, and they make Pressbooks available to their faculty to create these resources. And the nice thing about this ecosystem, just going back to the community discussion we were having earlier, is that if Arthur makes a great open free digital textbook on how to publish books in South Africa and I'm teaching in Montreal, I can just clone Arthur's book and adapt it to what I want it to look like and present that to my students. So that open kind of web-based delivery of books has been the driving force, I think. And we're relatively affordable compared to lots of other platforms. And so the institutions like working with us because the affordability of putting a tool like this in front of their instructors who can then deliver resources to their students at no cost is kind of the driving interest behind how people are using Pressbooks for the most part. Many other things are happening on it, but that's the main driver. And then the PDF becomes kind of an extra thing that people want, but that print on demand workflow is just not nearly as important within the framework of the open education as far as we can see.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see web books establish themselves as a format that institutions take seriously as a textbook. I know with some of our projects, we have to have a printed book in part to make the whole project seem more credible. There's some weird human psychology around if it's in print, it's a quote unquote real textbook. And sometimes that's really the only reason we're creating the print version, so that it can be around. But the students are all going to be using the free online version. Do you see something similar?
I also have that human quirk.
Mm.
I have always thought that like the best advertisement is the print versions of these books, but our clients and users and the students, they occasionally say they want it. No one actually does anything. So I don't think that's true across the board. I think there's a lot of value in paper books. I think there's a lot of reason why they are still important and valuable, but basically what the students actually want is a digital version of that book that they can access anywhere at any time. I think some of them download, like they like having access to a PDF and they can print off little bits and mark them up if they wish to, but generally the main use case is just on the web.
And most of these are freely accessible as well.
Yeah, so I don't know to what degree it's format preference versus price, but typically in the open ecosystem, your printed textbook is going to cost you $25 instead of the $250 that you would be paying your chemistry textbook or whatever. So I guess the problem is once you're doing books this big, even in print on demand, the price tag goes up no matter what the margin is. So
makes a big difference to all students, for sure. I wanted to speak a little bit about the fact that community and tool building still takes money of one sort or another. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these kinds of projects that try to empower communities with new tools face a collective action problem in that no one person or organization will benefit exclusively from the development because they're inherently shareable, both the code and the content being created. So it's hard to find people willing to invest in their development, suppose apart from philanthropy. How have you managed to piece together the resources for building these projects like Pressbooks over the years?
I would say I was naive about how, that collective action problem. I thought open source software that meets an important need in higher education, that there would be a lot of enthusiasm for paying us to develop that. That was not the case. Pressbooks in the end just became a software as service company where the underlying technology happens to be open source. So we're just a private business. We've occasionally, some of our development projects have been done sort of essentially through clients who might have gotten a grant of some kind. Sometimes we collaborate in that way where there's a specific tool set that we would like to accelerate, and there's a client who particularly wants that and has some funding available to do it. But Pressbooks itself has never gone out to get, foundation funding or anything like that. So we've just run as a little bootstrapped software as a service business. And I'm happy about that in the sense that, you're forced by necessity to just focus on whatever your clients think is the absolutely most important thing. LibriVox came out. I don't know what I was imagining the world to look like, but that project was really just on the enthusiasm of everyone's going to volunteer for everything and the world is going to be awesome in the future. And so that's kind of how that came out. Although I guess we did get one grant to build some software at that point, and occasionally we did little fundraisers to pay for a few things. The Internet Archive houses that. So we have sort of one of the big costs would be server costs for all that. So that's taken care of by the Internet Archive. And then Rebus, which is, we haven't spoken about Rebus, but that's a nonprofit that I started, and that has had foundation support, and that's more around the process of sort of helping groups of people create open resources, open textbook and open resources, but sort of basically building capacity within institutions to build these resources, because publishing is hard and harder than people expect.
What sort of capacity needs building? What are the skills you reckon people struggle most with when they first start creating books for themselves?
I think just people don't recognize the scale of all the things that goes into making a good book. The planning, what is the content going to be? In our case, what is effective educational content? Copy editing, structural editing. Oh, you've found a great photo on the web, but it's copyrighted. You can't put that in, even if it's a web-based interface. So there's all that. There's the producing, get everything, even Pressbooks is an easy tool to use, but there's twiddling that has to happen to make sure that it looks good on the output. Often these are collaborative projects with multiple people. So there's just kind of like a cat herding problem. Deadlines. What do you do when it's done? So is there any kind of, who do you announce to? So, publishing houses exist for a reason, and they do a lot of work that people are just completely unaware of. It seems to me many people think it just, they just took the Word file and turned it into a paper thing.
Sent it to the printer.
Yeah, there's just so much more that goes into the publishing process that people aren't aware of. And so when people take on an open textbook publishing project or program, they learn, okay, there's all these things and we have to figure out which things we can do, which we're just not going to do. And so be it, which we're going to do the best of our abilities. There are just many, many, many aspects that go into publishing. And at the end of the day, also, writing is hard and it takes a lot of energy to really get something good and final and edited and clean and ideally peer reviewed and all that kind of thing. So yeah, there's just a lot that goes into publishing. And so Rebus was built as kind of a companion, or envisioned as kind of a companion to Pressbooks, where if you were starting an open publishing program, be a mechanism to go through with a handful of books in a cohort to learn how to do this, and then you could go from there. Although originally, actually, it was also trying to build a platform with community, but that cost of doing that right didn't quite work out. So we focused just on that kind of capacity building training, and sort of, we call it very light project, not project management, but project structuring. So we help people understand what the project looks like. And there's kind of a set of interventions that happen along the way where the cohort gets together to talk about where they are in their publishing journey. So it's been very cool to watch that.
Every book comes with its own surprises, and I suppose one has to be ready for them. If an organization was interested in building that capacity, can they reach out to the Rebus Foundation and become involved?
The website is Rebus, REBUS.foundation. I think that will get you there.
Fantastic. We'll have a look and we'll put that in the show notes too. As we're running out of time, I wanted to ask a forward-looking question. You wrote back in 2012, and I'm going to read another long quote. You said, "A real change that I see coming is not so much in how we read, but the context around a book we read. If you imagine every book with its own URL, every chapter with its own URL, then you can start to think about the information in books being truly connected in ways it can't be with print books or ebooks as we've conceived them so far. I think that will change, where books live natively on the web first and then have different output formats. With this webification of books, we'll see connections being made from book to book, passage to passage, layers of commentary, links, the extraction and use of data, such as locations, times, and names. All these connections will sit atop a book and be turned on or off depending on the reader's preference. This layer will not necessarily be generated by the author or publisher, but rather by readers and other services that can access the book data and link to it and use it in different ways. I couldn't leave any of that out because it's all so rich with thinking and imagining. How do you feel we're doing? Are we seeing that, or has it worked out in a different way?
It's funny, if you had asked me 2 years ago, I would say we have done almost none of that. Very little of that has actually happened. And the reason is that two things. So in the world of traditional publishing, just is largely not interested in this, as far as I can tell. I know there are some siloed applications where some of this is happening in the academic space a little bit. And then on the open side, in the Pressbooks ecosystem, just the cost of building these really cool things goes beyond what the business model of at least my version of the open publishing universe has allowed. We haven't seen much of that. I think, however, that this is effectively what artificial intelligence is doing by having made an end run somehow, in my understanding, is basically slurping up lots of copyrighted content that probably they weren't really allowed to do. But those kinds of connections now between works and books are enabled by AI. And that's really exciting and interesting. I don't know what it does for the business model of the universe. Maybe does, McGraw-Hill layer an AI on top of their catalog? That's probably going to happen. So I think that AI might unlock a lot of this that was hard for people to imagine, whereas now it's a lot easier to build these kinds of things with AI than it was previously. And so I suspect we start to see more of this. But again, there's kind of battle lines that are starting to get drawn between publishers of content and the AI companies that would like to be doing things like this. So I think I underestimated the entrenched business model of publishing that doesn't want all these cool things because they can't figure out how to monetize it, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that people want to pay for the scale of what's needed. So it's hard to imagine that 200 years from now, when you and I are woken up from our cryogenic pods to have the 200th anniversary of this conversation, that all this won't be happening. But a lot of the things that I thought were going to happen to books, since I started working in this space in 2009, just have been so much slower than I would have expected. But such is life. But I don't even know what piece of writing that came from, but it's a very compelling vision of what books could be. So I congratulate young me for thinking about all that. Yeah, we're definitely not there yet.
Well, it's an interesting future, and thanks for thinking of it. I think that's an exciting thing to look forward to. And thank you so much for all your work and pioneering with communities and tools. It certainly made a huge impression on me and the way that I've tried to innovate and build, and I'm sure for many others as well.
I mentioned this before, Arthur, but I'll just say it again. Way back in the early days of Pressbooks, when I thought maybe I need to shut this down because I don't know how to fund it, you gave me a Shuttleworth lightning grant or something. I can't remember what it was called.
Flash grant.
Yeah, flash grant. And it was $5,000. And that probably kept Pressbooks alive. So the fact that it managed to stay alive is at least in part due to your generosity there. So you're a big part of it.
That's made my day. Oh, I'm so glad. That was a great privilege for me to be able to make that nomination. The Shuttleworth Foundation at the time had these little grants that its fellows could give to people that they thought were doing really important work, and you certainly were. Thanks, you. It's been a pleasure.
Bye, Arthur.
This episode was edited by Helen LaRue and researched by Clara Skinner. How Books Are Made is supported by Electric Bookworks, where we develop and design books for organizations around the world. You can find us online at electricbookworks.com.